Welcome to Stay Home, Stay Focused. I'm Jack Moline. I'm president of Interfaith Alliance. My guest today is my friend and the former chair of the Interfaith Alliance board, Helio Fred Garcia. And Fred, I am just delighted you're able to join us today. I
Thank
want to ask you what I ask each of our guests as we begin. How are you doing in the midst of all of this?
I'm fine. I consider myself very fortunate in that my wife and I, 18 months ago, bought a house in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been here for the last month, and I'm here probably until they give the all clear back in New York, where I nominally live. It could be a lot worse. I feel for those who did not have a safe refuge and are sheltering in place in a more difficult spot.
Well, that's a very typical statement from a person of compassion like you. What are you focusing on to keep you inspired and somewhat distracted from the necessity of dealing with this coronavirus?
Well, I run a firm that advises institutions on how to get through crises well. So as you can imagine, we're really busy. We are busy advising hospitals, advising companies, advising leaders on how to connect with their people and how to keep people focused on getting through this well. One of the things that we are calling on leaders to do is to go out of their way to show kindness, because people are feeling very fraught. There is not only a lot of fear, but we are social creatures, and the idea of being unable to have social contact except through some screen, as you and I are doing right now, is just causing a lot of people a lot of distress. And the more we can help each other get through this, the better we'll be. And so my colleagues and I, in addition to calling for the best practices technically on how to communicate economic news and employment news and other things, are trying to help leaders establish a tone of support and kindness to get through this.
Have you ever had to deal with a crisis like this in your work before?
We deal with crises all the time. What makes COVID-19 different is that it's really 7 different crises in one.
Oh, tell us about all 7.
We have the public health crisis, which is substantial and growing and not getting better anytime soon. And we are seeing strains on the health system, and we're seeing fatalities among health workers, and we're seeing a spike in fatalities across the nation, even as it seems to be flattening in some of the early places. We have a business crisis, but unlike most other business crises that affect a particular company or sector or geographic region, every institution in the United States and beyond is being profoundly affected by this. So it has an effect on revenues, it has an effect on cost, it has an effect on operations. We have an economic crisis. A month and a half ago, the smart word on Wall Street was we're not going to have a recession in 2020. Well, that's been thrown out the window. We are facing severe economic uncertainty, the possibility not only of economic decline, but of economic collapse, and that is causing a lot of problems. We have an information crisis where there still isn't agreement among leaders and others about what causes the transmission of the virus, about how we can get tested, where we can get tested, whether we can get tested, what we can get tested for. So we have this disparity of knowledge about how to get through the crisis. We frankly have a competence of government crisis. We have yet to see a whole of government response. We have fragments of government response, and some governors are doing remarkable stuff, like the governors in New York and surrounding states, and California and surrounding states, but some governors are still calling for people to come together, even though all the public health experts say that's not a good thing to do. We have a social crisis, and that social crisis begins with just having our lives disrupted. But I've seen a troubling trend of incivility in the last month, and that incivility has taken a number of forms, including violence and insult against people wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. But the bigger one is, as the president continues to call this the China virus or the Chinese virus, there's a surge of hate crimes against people perceived to be Asian or Asian American. There's been violence. There was acid thrown in a young Chinese American woman's face in Brooklyn last week. There's a young boy from Burma, from Myanmar, who was stabbed in the face in a retail store in Texas. His father was also stabbed in the face. And the person who was arrested for the stabbing said she was doing it because of the virus and because the Chinese were bringing it in. That's the subject of how I'm keeping myself busy otherwise. But the final part of the crisis is we have a mental health crisis. And there's increasing instances of depression, of other forms of difficulties people have coping, first with loss of the way things are, with loss of loved ones, with fear of loss of loved ones. We have not had these 7 different dimensions of crisis simultaneously. And that is causing all institutions to have to reimagine what it's like to get through the crisis. What I'm spending much of my time on is getting ready for the launch of my next book, which is about language that provokes violence, including mass violence. And that is a project I started working on immediately after the day after the Tree of Life shooting in 2018. And it will be published at the end of May. Formal publication date is June, but shipping will be in May. And although the president isn't the totality of the book, he has a major role in the book because I have studied language and the patterns of language that lead to insult and oppression and exclusion and violence up to mass violence and worse. And what I find is there's a playbook that autocrats, authoritarians, and narcissistic leaders use, consisting of 12 forms of language that predictably lead to violence. And as I've studied previous instances of large instances of violence, I find that that pattern is predictable and repeatable and observable. And the president uses all 12 forms of that language and has been using it persistently. And so in the book, I document that kind of language. I document its use prior to the president, its use by the president, and I describe a path forward on how to get beyond where we are so that civic leaders, such as yourself, engaged citizens, such as me, can call attention to this and hold leaders accountable for the consequence of their language.
Just for the record, the book is called Words on Fire, and the subtitle is?
The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. Words on Fire is based on what a number of people have said about leaders who've used such language as you're playing with fire. You're playing with fire. And the president's language has gone from merely incendiary to outright on fire.
So we know we've seen a lot of this kind of language in the political landscape that preceded the coronavirus.
Yes.
Are you seeing this kind of incendiary language used by the president and by others in the midst of this coronavirus crisis?
The very language of China virus stigmatizes a group. The World Health Organization advises against naming diseases for countries. Now, the counter argument is, oh, but Zika is a river and Ebola is a river. But you don't see people and say, oh, they're Ebolan, let's get them. But what has happened is when the president stigmatizes a group, we see a corresponding and immediate increase in acts of insult and oppression and exclusion and violence against people perceived to be members of that group. I'm going to ask you to think back to July, when the president started saying about congresswomen of color that they should go back where they came from. Immigrants suddenly were on the receiving end of oppression, exclusion, insult, and violence. In particular, people whose appearance suggested that they could be or could be descended from immigrants. So people from Asia, people who seem to be from Latin America, people who seem to be from Africa, were on the receiving end of hate crimes. We are seeing the very same thing here in the use of the phrase China virus.
So I'm wondering, it's pretty clear that these words appeal to a dark and uncomfortable place inside the human mind and our proclivity to stigmatize people. Is there a tactic for using these words to positive effect?
We as engaged citizens, and you as a civic leader, as well as an engaged citizen, can find ways to reject the frame that says there's an us and a them. We're all in this together. And one of the sources I point to in my book is the Yale philosopher Jason Stanley, who says that one of the hallmarks of what he calls fascist politics is the assertion that there is an other that is less worthy than we are, and that is used politically, historically, around the world to keep people fighting with each other, and that allows the leader to amass political power. We need to resist the temptation to allow leaders to define us as separate groups opposed to each other, that we are the human race, that we are all in this together, and we have more in common that divides us, e pluribus unum. We need to resist and reject the otherizing of people for whatever reason, especially when the population as a whole is feeling fragile, is feeling vulnerable. When I say that this is a time that calls for kindness, that's because it's so easy to lapse into the opposite. It's so easy to lapse into cruelty. It's so easy to lapse into lashing out at innocent people simply because we feel vulnerable. So part of what civic leaders and engaged citizens need to do is to recognize that's a technique. It is something that is used intentionally, and we should not allow that to model our own behavior. And we can raise the alarm when that behavior is manifest.
So I know that you've identified individuals, we call them lone wolves, not a phrase of your coining, but one that you use and help to explain, who have heard this language and been motivated to act on the message that they hear coming from these dog whistles, these lone wolf whistles, as you call them, that have been put out there. In your experience, can the opposite be activated as well? Is there language that will inspire people who are inspired to be kindly towards other people to react to that kind of language? Are there examples that you've looked at of leaders, politicians, or otherwise, who have inspired the best in people rather than the worst?
I normally study and write about leaders who are inspired the best. In the book, I do begin with 3 leaders who faced real national crisis and who use language to bring the best out in people. I start the book with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and taking office, and in his very first words as president says, "We are all in this together, that your struggles are my struggles. We can get through this. The nation has persevered before." The very first words, even before he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," his very first words were, "We're all in this together and we'll get through it." I also profile the first 5 weeks of Winston Churchill's premiership in 1940. And in his first address to the Parliament and to the nation, and he was presiding over a divided government, he did not have a majority of the Parliament, he said, "We are in this together. We together can resist the Nazi onslaught. We together can defeat the menace that Germany represents across the Channel." He called for unity. I also profile the early weeks of John F. Kennedy's presidency, when he called for the nation to send a human being safely to the moon and bring that human being safely back to Earth. And he said, this is a national, in fact, this is a humankind-wide endeavor. So I begin the book by pointing to leaders who bring people together to have a stark contrast to those who use language to divide.
Well, it's good to know that this is language which cannot just be weaponized; it can be authorized, and that's an uplifting message in what is sometimes a troubling depiction of the kind of leadership that we're facing in lots of places today, including the United States.
And on that, Jack, I close the book by pointing to leaders who stepped over the line, put people at risk, were called on it, and acknowledged, some immediately and some eventually, I've gone too far, I need to go back, I need to apologize, I need to reset expectations. So even leaders who go over the line can step back and try to make remedial actions, remedial commentary. And we need to know that, because the problem is not a particular individual. The problem is the human tendency to go too far and put people at risk. And leaders need to know that they have the capacity to step back.
It's an essential message in all of the faith communities that we deal with at Interfaith Alliance, that there is no such thing as an indelible mistake. You can always walk it back. The residue may be there, but you can make things better. I want to change things up just a little bit in these next few minutes, Fred, because I know you to live a peripatetic existence. You are constantly on the go. Following your Facebook page is like a travelogue. And you have been rooted in Santa Fe. We all feel sorry for you about that. For how long now?
I'm in my 32nd day in my home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I typically am on 4 to 7 airplane flights a week. I sleep in hotels about 240 nights a year. This is the longest I've had my head on the same pillow in decades. I have to say, I'm starting to like it.
Well, that was the question. Do you miss the road?
I miss what happens when I get to my clients. It's not quite the same, as I'm sure is the case with you in your role and prior role as a pulpit rabbi, that there's something about that human connection that is really powerful. I don't like the process of getting there, but I like what happens when I get there.
This will lift eventually, and you'll be able to leave the great state of New Mexico and head where you're going. You're going to have to go some places. Where will you want to go?
I want to go back to New York. I want to be with my students at NYU and Columbia. I miss them. I feel for what they are going through. I want to be with the members of my firm. I miss them, even though I talk to them and see them through Zoom every day. But I want to be present with those who have struggled more than I have. And I want to be in solidarity with them. I also want to visit my clients. They have been steadfast through all of this as human beings. They're going through the same things we are. But I want to, in the language of your profession, to be part of the ministry of presence. And there's something about having to do this through a machine that is reinventing the way we imagine what is possible, but it isn't quite the same as the human bond, the human connection.
Well, I'm very glad that among the people who will be reimagining what our life is going to be like in the new normal will be you, Fred, because as I hope people have understood over the last 20 minutes, you are someone who thinks seriously and expertly about the human condition and how it can be improved, especially by avoiding how it can be denigrated. So I thank you for this. The last question I ask each of my guests is if they can offer something to the people who are watching this at home, listening to it on their computer, about inspiration to find engagement and inspiration in their life that isn't a matter of simply protecting themselves and their loved ones. What do you commend to people?
This is a time that calls for kindness at a level and a scale that we haven't experienced in a very long time. In the aftermath of natural disasters, in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, there's a tendency to come together that is short-lived, it is geographically contained. This is global. So if ever there was a time to default to kindness towards strangers, be kind to the supermarket clerk, be kind to the mail deliverer, be kind to the FedEx deliverer, be kind to the first responder. They are going through things that are far worse than we are. They need that expression of kindness. So thank people more than you otherwise would. Through your mask, make eye contact with people and smile. They will see the effect of the smile in your eyes. We need to connect with each other humanly and not just get in, get out, get home.
Helio, Fred Garcia, thank you for being with us. I recommend everybody to watch for the release of your book before too long, Words on Fire.
Order on Amazon now.
You can order it now on Amazon. There you go. And to all of you listening and watching at home, stay safe, stay focused.